The station had no name on any map they were willing to show me. I'd been down in Sublevel 4 for 11 hours by then, which was long enough to learn that Sublevel 4 was itself a polite fiction. The transit hub had been expanded and re-expanded by 6 different construction contracts over 90 years, and the actual physical structure bore the same relationship to the official blueprints that a living city bears to the one the original planners drew. Close in spirit, unrecognizable in the details. The junction housing I'd been sent to assess had been logged in the maintenance database as J4117, but when I got to the coordinates J4117 was supposed to occupy, I found a wall. Not a newly installed wall. A wall with 70 years of grime and the faded stencil of a route designation system that predated the current Compact Transit Authority by 3 administrative reorganizations. The actual junction, when I found it by following the power conduit rather than the map, was 11 meters to the left and 1 level down, in a corridor that connected to the official sublevel system through a maintenance passage, so narrow I had to turn sideways to get through it. I should have written it up and gone back to the surface. That was what the job was. Find the discrepancy, document the discrepancy, submit the documentation. Let someone else figure out what it meant. But I had been doing this work for 16 years across 7 different transit systems on 4 different worlds, and I had developed the kind of instinct that comes from spending enough time in the spaces between the official maps, the instinct that says this corridor is wrong in a way that goes somewhere interesting. So I followed it. I went through the maintenance passage sideways, noted the junction at the other end, continued into the unnamed corridor, pulled out my chalk marker and left a bright orange X on the wall so I could find my way back, and kept going. The corridor ended at a wider junction space, hexagonal, with 6 branching routes sealed behind decommissioned access panels. 5 of the panels had the smooth, settling quality of something that had not been opened in decades. The 6th had a slightly different texture at the lower left corner. Recent handling, not maintenance access recent, furtive recent, the specific pattern of something being touched in a way that tries not to leave traces. I crouched down and looked at the space beneath the panel. There was a gap, maybe 20 centimeters at the widest. I shone my work light through it. 2 amber eyes with 7 rings in the iris looked back at me. I did not startle. I had spent enough time in maintenance corridors to have found stranger things. Stowaways, malfunctioning drones, once a species of fungal organism that had colonized a decommissioned section of the Port Callaway Metro, and that the official maintenance staff had been assiduously not mentioning in their reports for 40 years, because they did not know what it was and did not want to file the paperwork that would require them to find out. I just stayed crouched, work light low, and waited. The eyes stayed level. They did not blink in any rhythm I recognized. They were examining me with the same systematic attention I was giving them, and I had the feeling, the very specific feeling I sometimes got in old transit infrastructure when the geometry was complex enough, that I was not the first thing those eyes had assessed today and found wanting, and that whatever assessment they were running on me now had different criteria than the previous ones. I lowered the work light further, aiming it at the floor rather than directly at the panel, so the ambient light would be easier. I settled my weight back on my heels. I put the chalk marker down on the floor beside me slowly, in a movement I tried to make legible. I am not holding anything. After a while, maybe 2 minutes, maybe 3, it was hard to say, there was a sound from behind the panel. A small sound, deliberate, the specific sound of something making a decision about whether to move. Then the lower left corner of the panel shifted outward, and she crawled through. She was small. She was very small, in the way that stopped me from making any quick assessments about age, because I had been around enough non-human children by then to know that size and developmental stage do not map onto each other the way they do for humans, and I did not want to get it wrong. She had a quality of stillness that children of any species do not usually have, the kind of stillness that comes from learning, very thoroughly, not to be noticed. Her hands were interesting, 4 fingers on the right, 5 on the left, and she was counting something on them as she came through the panel, lips moving, some internal calculation proceeding independently of everything else. She wore a set of garments that had been cut down from something adult-sized by someone who knew how to do that kind of work, and she had done it herself. I realized after a moment, because the seams had a child's precision, technically correct, optimistically confident in its proportions. She came through the panel and stood up and looked at me. I looked at her. I held up one finger. She looked at the finger for a long time. Then she held up 4 on her left hand. Then she folded them all down and held up 1. We stayed like that for a moment, 1 finger each, and I felt the way I felt sometimes in complex transit systems when I finally understood the actual topology of the place. Not triumph exactly, but recognition. There. That is the shape. I said, in the 4 languages I had that were not English, the equivalent of hello. She did not respond to any of them. She was still watching me with the 7-ringed eyes, taking notes. I said in English, "I am not going to hurt you." She did not respond to that either, probably because she did not know the language, but something in her posture shifted slightly. Not relaxed. I did not think she knew how to relax, not then, but fractionally less prepared to run. I picked up my clipboard and my chalk marker slowly and made a mark on the floor, a simple line, and held up the chalk marker toward her. She looked at the chalk marker. She looked at the mark on the floor. She looked at me. Then she reached out and took the chalk marker from my hand very carefully and made a mark of her own on the floor. A loop folded back on itself. A surface with no edges, connected to itself in a way that should not be possible in 3 dimensions but somehow was. I looked at the shape. I looked at her. "Okay," I said. "Okay." I called her Myra because her actual name was a topological position. A description, she would tell me much later, of where something was in relation to everything else. Specifically the property of a fold that persists after the surface appears to have flattened, which is true of certain configurations of space, and also, as it turned out, of her. The translation the hub's interpretation system offered was 4 lines long and contained 3 mathematical terms, and she accepted Myra with the equanimity of someone who understood that all names are approximations, and some approximations are more useful than others. She did not tell me any of this for some time. In the first weeks, she did not speak to me at all in any language I recognized. She communicated in the ways that do not require language. She indicated hunger by sitting near the commissary unit with a very specific quality of patient attention. She indicated approval of a thing by making a small mark beside it, which I eventually realized was a topological notation meaning stable or closed, a configuration that holds. She indicated wariness of a person or situation by going very still in the way she had been still behind the panel, all her attention focused inward. She was wary of most things. She was not wary of me after the first day, which I took seriously as a piece of information without fully understanding it. I gave her my spare bunk. I modified the commissary unit settings to include the nutrient profiles of 3 non-human species I had worked alongside before, guessing at what might work for her, and she ate slowly and carefully from 2 of them and not at all from the 3rd, and her color, a kind of iridescent undertone in her skin that I had not noticed at first, shifted slightly toward something warmer after she ate, which I decided to read as a good sign. I went to work and came back and she was always there. Never exactly where I had left her, but always within the space of our quarters, and she was always doing something, drawing on surfaces, arranging small objects in configurations that I recognized, after a while, as mathematical diagrams in 3 dimensions, sitting with her hands on her knees and her 7-ringed eyes closed, moving through whatever internal process she was running. I filed a report on the 9th day, not about her, about the junction I had actually been sent to assess, which I had gone back and documented properly, along with the maintenance passage and the unnamed corridor and the hexagonal junction space with its 6 decommissioned access panels. I noted the corridor as requiring further topological assessment. I did not note the child. I told myself this was temporary. I told myself I was waiting until I understood the situation better before involving the official systems, because the official systems moved slowly and poorly, and I wanted to know what I was dealing with before I handed it to them. This was not entirely untrue. It was also not the whole truth. The whole truth was that she had looked at me with those 7-ringed eyes and held up one finger, and something in my chest had done something I did not have a name for, and whatever that thing was, it had opinions about what was temporary and what was not. I started carrying her drawings on their scrap surfaces back to my bunk and examining them at night. The first ones were simple enough. Topological figures, loops and surfaces, the shapes that mathematicians have names for and that show up in very few places in ordinary life. But they grew more complex. She added annotations in a notation system I did not recognize at first, until I found a pattern in the recurring symbols and realized it was an abbreviated version of something I had seen in a footnote of a transit engineering paper I had read 6 years ago, which had cited a theoretical framework I had not followed up on because it had seemed too theoretical for infrastructure work. I went back to that paper. I went back to the footnote. I followed the citation chain. The Velhari. I had heard the name once in passing from another transit auditor at a professional conference 3 years before I was posted to Meridian 9. She had mentioned them the way you mention something that has been tidied away. Not critically, not with weight, just as context for something else she was saying about the compact's transit monopoly. Before the Velhari situation was resolved, she had said, and moved on, and I had moved on too because the phrase had the quality of bureaucratic settled matter, the kind of thing that has a file number and a closure date and nothing left to investigate. I investigated now. The Velhari had been one of the 14 founding peoples of the Galactic Compact. They had been, a people who understood space the way some peoples understand music, intuitively, deeply, in their bodies and their mathematics simultaneously. They built their communities in folds and pockets of local spacetime that the Compact's survey instruments recorded as unusually consistent, unusually stable, unusually easy to navigate to and from, and then failed to follow up on because the instruments did not flag them as anomalous, only as particularly pleasant places to establish transit nodes. What the Velhari had discovered, or developed, or perhaps simply described in language precise enough to use, I came to understand that, for them, there was no meaningful difference between those 3 things, was a method of identifying and utilizing topological connections in space that predated the construction of any infrastructure. Space, they said, is already connected in certain ways. What we call transit is mostly the process of refusing to notice those connections and building expensive alternatives. The Velhari work showed the connections. It showed which places were already adjacent in ways the official maps did not record, and why, and how you could step from one to another without moving through the intervening space at all, not because you had done something clever with technology, but because the topology was already there, already real, waiting to be described. This made the Compact's transit monopoly, which was built on controlling the physical infrastructure of movement through space, into something like a very large and very expensive pretense. The 7 kingdoms that voted to dissolve the Velhari conclave had done so in a closed session, citing topological sovereignty concerns, which was the bureaucratic language, for we have decided that the shape of space belongs to us. The dissolution was administrative rather than military. No ships, no weapons, no burning, just the slow, systematic removal of the Velhari from every record that mattered, the genealogy registry, the cultural authority database, the academic accreditation system, the transit network routing tables. You cannot erase a people if they still exist in the official record. But if you erase the record first, the people become, in the language of the Compact's central registry, unresolved matter. And unresolved matter is subject, by standard administrative procedure, to administrative resolution. The last record of any Velhari entity in the Compact's official database was dated 14 months before I found Myra behind a decommissioned access panel in an unnamed corridor on sublevel 4. I sat with this information for a long time. I sat with it in the way I sit with a complex junction problem, turning it over, looking at it from different angles, trying to understand the actual shape of the thing rather than the shape the official maps suggested it had. Then I went back to our quarters, where Myra was asleep on her bunk with her right hand, the one with 4 fingers, tucked under her chin and her lips moving slightly in the way they moved when she was doing mathematics in her sleep. I sat in the chair across from her and watched her breathe, and I thought about what temporary had meant when I had used it 2 weeks ago, and I thought about what it meant now. When she woke up, she found me still sitting there. She looked at me for a long moment with those 7-ringed eyes that saw too much. Then she held up one finger. I held up one finger back. She nodded once, as if something had been confirmed, and got up and went to the commissary unit. I never filed the report about her, not the official one. I filed everything else, the junction assessment, the topological anomaly notation, 17 months of infrastructure documentation on sublevels 3 through 9, and I kept 2 sets of records. The official ones went into the hub's maintenance system. The other ones, on actual paper with actual ink, went into the lining of a bag I had carried since Earth, the one that had survived 16 years and 7 postings, and the specific kind of institutional chaos that eats digital records and leaves physical ones alone simply because nobody thinks to look for them. The paper records were a growing body of evidence about a child who did not officially exist, and the people who had been made to not exist, and the theoretical framework that had gotten them made to not exist. I was a transit auditor. This was not my field, but I had spent 16 years learning how the spaces between the official maps worked, and I was beginning to understand that this was exactly my field. I just had not known it yet. She learned my language in a way that I can only describe as structural. She did not learn it word by word. She learned the grammar first, the way English assembles meaning from the sequence of things rather than from the shapes of the words, and then populated the structure with vocabulary so rapidly that within 3 months she was using idioms she had, as far as I could tell, inferred from context rather than learned directly. Her pronunciation was exact. Her vocabulary was occasionally startling. She used the word administrative correctly in context before she had learned the word table. The first full sentence she said to me in English was, "You write things down so you do not lose them." But there were others that stay with me more precisely because they were smaller and more specific. She said, the day she first came with me to the commissary and watched me interact with the hub's automated service system, "It does not see me." Not as a complaint, as an observation, technical in quality, noting a system property. The commissary's automated registry required a compact citizen identification to log a transaction. She did not have one. She was not in the system. She did not exist, in the narrow sense in which the system understood existence. "No," I said, "but I see you." She looked at me. Then she said, "That is sufficient," with the gravity of someone who has thought carefully about what sufficiency means and arrived at a precise definition. I filed the first formal inquiry about Velhari genealogical registration procedures 6 months after I found her. I filed it as an administrative query, citing infrastructure documentation purposes. I needed to understand the historical transit routing associated with the Velhari conclave. I said, to properly assess the spatial anomalies I had noted in the sublevel 7 junction complex. This was true. it was also not the reason I was filing the query. The response came back in 2 weeks. There was no current Velhari genealogical registration procedure, because the Velhari conclave was no longer a recognized entity under compact law. Any entity seeking to establish genealogical connection to the Velhari conclave would need to petition the compact's central registry for reinstatement of the conclave's administrative standing, which would require documentation from a recognized cultural authority, which would need to be a compact member kingdom or affiliated body, none of which had sponsored the Velhari conclave in the 14 months since its dissolution. The loop was clean. It was a very well-designed loop. I filed 8 more queries over the next 4 months, each one probing a different junction of the loop. How did a dissolved conclave's academic work get incorporated into the general record? Who maintained custody of unaffiliated genealogical data during administrative dissolution proceedings? What was the procedure for re-registration of an entity whose dissolution had been contested? Was there a contested dissolution on file for the Velhari conclave? If not, why not, given that the dissolution vote had required unanimous conclave membership consent under the Compact Formation Treaty, and the Velhari had, to anyone's knowledge, not consented? That last one generated a response time of 11 weeks and a format that I had learned by then to read as bureaucratic scar tissue, carefully written, technically responsive, saying nothing. But the response time itself was information. 11 weeks meant someone had escalated the query and decided how to handle it before responding, which meant the question had been noticed by someone who had the authority to notice things and the motivation to be careful about what they said. I made a note of that and filed 3 more queries. Myra, during all of this, was learning things. She had found the Transit Hub's decommissioned data library on Sublevel 9 during one of her explorations, which I had learned to neither encourage nor discourage. She explored the Hub's maintenance infrastructure the way she explored everything, systematically, geometrically, following connections rather than corridors. She came back one afternoon with 17 data tablets she had identified in a storage archive, their case marked in a notation system she recognized as Velhari Academic, that the Hub's automated decommissioning process had cataloged as unresolvable format and therefore not purged. They were her people's work. Pre-dissolution physics, topology, practical applications of spatial folding theory. Some text that appeared to be the Velhari equivalent of philosophical writing, and that Myra read with an expression I had never seen on her face before, which was the expression of someone reading something that knows them. She read for 3 days straight, sleeping in 2-hour intervals and then immediately returning to the tablets. I left food near her. I did not interrupt. I understood, watching her, that this was something that needed to happen without me in it. On the 4th day she looked up and said, "They were trying to give it to everyone." What? The fold, the description. They wanted to publish it so broadly that no one could suppress it, but they were, she paused, finding the English. They were too careful. They wanted to make sure it was right first. They kept it in the academic structure with review and verification, and the kingdoms moved while it was still in review. How close were they? She looked at the tablets. The verification was complete, she said. The publication was scheduled. The kingdoms moved 4 days before the publication date. I thought about this, so it exists. The complete work. On those tablets, she said, and on the Hub's decommissioned archive server, and in whatever other copies survived the dissolution process in systems that were not fully purged. She looked at me. Records are harder to erase than people. Yes, I said, they are. The first formal attempt to remove Myra from my quarters came 8 months after I found her. It was done cleanly. An administrative transfer notice, filed at 300 Hub time, citing Compact Minor Persons Protocol Clause 7F, which governed the placement of unregistered minor entities found within compact transit infrastructure. The notice logged her as item UMPA 9174, which was an inventory designation, not a name. It directed me to present her to the Compact Welfare Processing Office on Level 2 by 800. I read the notice at 600. I sat with it for 20 minutes. Then I pulled up the Compact Transit Infrastructure Emergency Protocol, a document I had read thoroughly 6 weeks before, the way I read every document in the maintenance system thoroughly, because you never know which junction you will need, and I filed an emergency infrastructure hold. The hold cited a potential spatial anomaly in sublevels 3 through 7 that required continuous monitoring by specialized personnel, specifically me, and that any disruption to monitoring continuity, including personnel transfers or administrative interruptions, would require sign-off from the Compact's chief transit architect. The chief transit architect was, as I noted in the hold filing, currently in a 6-week review cycle, operating under communication embargo and unavailable for expedited approvals. The transfer notice went into processing queue. I had 6 weeks minimum, probably more. I spent those weeks doing 3 things. I continued the infrastructure documentation, because the spatial anomaly I had cited was real. Myra had shown me, in her methodical way, that the junction geometry in sublevel 7 was wrong in several places in ways the official blueprints did not account for, and that the wrongness was consistent with a folding property in the local spacetime that should not have been there if the Compact's models of that region were accurate, which they were not. And I needed the documentation to be genuine, because official documents that are not genuine eventually fail in ways that genuine documents do not. I continued filing administrative queries about Velhari registration, and I began, carefully, to understand the boundary question. The Unregistered Matter Disposition Act, which I found in the administrative database 3 weeks after the transfer notice, was the mechanism the Compact used for exactly the situation Myra represented. An entity found in Compact transit infrastructure with no registry standing and no recognized cultural affiliation. The Act defined its jurisdiction using a boundary document from the original Compact Formation Treaty. The boundary document defined the physical extent of Compact jurisdiction using a coordinate system. The coordinate system had been developed by the Velhari. I know enough topology to recognize a non-orientable surface when I see one described in formal language. The boundary document, when I worked through the geometry, described a region of space that did not have a consistent inside and outside. It had one continuous surface. Anything described as within Compact jurisdiction by that document was simultaneously inside and outside, because that was the mathematical property of the surface. The jurisdictional claim was not, in any formal geometric sense, operative. I spent 3 nights on this, not because the math was hard, I had it in the first night, but because I needed to be certain before I filed it. Certainty in infrastructure documentation means being able to explain exactly what is wrong and exactly why, and exactly what the correct version should be, in language clear enough that a reviewer who wants to find an error cannot find one. I checked every step. I had Myra check every step, which she did in 45 minutes and which produced 3 annotations that improved the clarity of the argument considerably. Then I filed it as an infrastructure assessment. I sent it to 14 offices. 3 of them were in kingdoms that had not signed the joint petition and therefore had at least theoretical reason to take the question seriously. One of them was the Compact's Chief Transit Architect's office, currently in review cycle, where it would sit unacknowledged but on the record. One of them was the mathematics faculty of the Meridian Assembly's own engineering bureau, who were academics and therefore, in my experience, more interested in whether the math was right than in what the math implied about the institution they worked for. The peer review from the mathematics faculty came back in 4 weeks. It said the geometric analysis was correct. the joint petition from the three kingdoms, which had arrived in the 7th week, combining the original transfer notice with additional jurisdictional claims under the Unregistered Matter Disposition Act, was withdrawn in week 11. It was not over, it was not close to over. Myra had said, "They will try again." She was right. There were 3 more attempts over the next 2 years. Each one was more complex than the last, and each one required a more complex response, and each time I followed the same method. Find the junction where the new mechanism connects to the existing record, document the junction, file the documentation, make the connection part of the official infrastructure of the dispute. What changed was Myra. Not fundamentally. She was who she was from the moment she crawled out from behind the decommissioned access panel. Precise, systematic, patient in the way that comes from having nowhere safe to be impatient, possessed of a mathematical understanding of space that made my own look like a map of a city drawn from memory by someone who visited once. But she grew. In pulses, days of deep sleep followed by days of what she described to me once as consolidation, the integration of everything the resting period had processed. She grew in what I can only call the scope of what she was willing to reach for. In the first year, she showed me her mathematics cautiously, as if waiting each time to see whether I would understand or misunderstand, and adjusting the depth of the next explanation based on the result. In the second year, she started explaining things I had not asked about, because she had assessed that I could follow them, and that they were things I should know. In the third year, she started asking me questions about the administrative record, about which offices had responded to which filings, and what the response timing meant, about the ways that bureaucratic language revealed the shape of the institution using it. She was learning my kind of topology, the topology of systems built by people, which follow the same fundamental rules as the topology of space, but which are navigated with different tools. The form is a junction, she told me once, with the certainty of someone who has tested a hypothesis and found it holds. When you file a form, you create a connection between the thing that exists and the record of its existence. You cannot collapse the connection afterward without removing both ends. That is why you do it. Not because the form will help you, because the form makes it structurally harder to erase you. That is right, I said. That is what they did not understand, she said. About my people, they thought they could erase the record and then the people would stop being real, but we had already created connections, the academic work, the transit routing data, the survey records, the fold description in the engineering library footnotes that you found. She looked at me. You found it because it survived. It survived because we put it in enough places. You were a child when they dissolved the conclave. I was in pulse, she said, using the Velhari word. I do not have the memories myself, but it is in the texts. They knew what was coming. They tried to distribute the work as widely as possible before it happened. They ran out of time. We will finish it, I said. She looked at me steadily. Yes, she said, we will. I filed the first formal record of Velhari theoretical physics in the Compact's academic registry, 14 months after I found Myra. I had spent those 14 months building the infrastructure for it. The peer relationships with the mathematics faculty, the official standing of my infrastructure assessments as a citation source, the record of queries and responses that established the Velhari theoretical framework as a substantive body of work rather than a dissolved conclave's unsupported claims. When I finally filed the theoretical physics record itself, it had 6 academic citations, 3 institutional peer reviews, and a notation linking it to 7 separate infrastructure assessments in the official maintenance database of Compact Transit Hub Meridian 9. The kingdoms noticed in week 3. By then it was in the record. The hearings were the longest I had participated in. They lasted 4 months and involved 8 administrative sessions and 1 formal review panel. I prepared for each one the way I prepared for complex junction assessments. by understanding the complete geometry of the situation before I entered the room, so that nothing anyone said to me could introduce a confusion about the shape of the thing. Myra came to the final hearing. She was 8, or she was in the growth period that functioned like being 8, and she had put on the formal version of her clothes and carried a chalk marker in her pocket, and she sat beside me in a room of representatives from 4 kingdoms and the Compact's Central Administrative Board, and she answered questions with the focused, unhurried precision she brought to every mathematical problem, and twice she drew things on the table to illustrate a point. And the third time she reached for her chalk, the Orith Conclave's representative said quickly, "That will not be necessary," and Myra put the chalk back in her pocket and said, "All right," and did not move or change expression. But something in her posture was the posture of someone who has just confirmed something they already knew. The formal recognition came 6 weeks later. It acknowledged her as a registered person under compact law. It acknowledged the Velhari theoretical framework as a legitimate academic body of work. It acknowledged the jurisdictional question as requiring ongoing review. It did not apologize. It used the language that official documents use when they are required to acknowledge something they would have preferred to keep unacknowledged. Technical, precise, stripped of any word that might be later characterized as an admission. I read it alone first, then I took it to Myra. She read it herself carefully, the way she read everything. Then she set it down. "Is it enough?" I asked. She thought about it seriously, the way she took everything seriously. "No," she said, "but it is a record." She looked up at me. "And now the record includes us." "It includes you," I said. "You were always." "No," she said, "but now the system knows." She was quiet for a moment. Then she picked up her chalk marker and drew on the floor beside her bunk, a surface, looped, connected back through itself, one side, no inside and no outside. A Möbius strip. The shape that the Compact's boundary document had accidentally described and that we had used to establish, in 14 administrative filings across 4 years, that certain claims to jurisdiction over certain things were not geometrically coherent. "The tunnels remember," she said. I had heard that many times by then. I understood it now completely. The unnamed corridor on sublevel 4, the decommissioned data library on sublevel 9, the 14 administrative files with their responses and their response times, the geometry proof in the infrastructure record, the academic filing under a name that was a description of something that persisted. The peer reviews and the query logs and the journalist sources I had cultivated carefully in the 3rd year, when I understood that the record needed to extend outside the Compact's own systems to be truly durable. The tunnels remember, even when they close the station, even when they remove the name from the map, the connection exists, the junction is real, you cannot collapse one end without the other. I had found her in an unnamed corridor, and she had decided she had run far enough, and from the single point of that meeting, 1 finger each, the topological minimum of connection, we had traced a path that now existed in a record that was harder to erase than either of us, harder to erase than the people who wanted her erased, harder to erase than the kingdoms that had dissolved her people through administrative procedure and called it resolution. She was not resolved. She was the last Velhari, and she was going to be fine, not because the kingdoms had stopped wanting the problem she represented to disappear, not because the Compact had become something other than what it was, but because she had spent 8 years learning to put herself into the record in ways that could not be cleanly removed, and because I had spent 4 years learning to file the forms in the corridors that the powerful never used, and because we had been doing this together, and the together was itself a junction in the record now, documented and cited and harder to erase than the official versions of things ever are. We went back to work. She had data tablets and I had a junction assessment on sublevel 5, and we were both behind on our actual work because the hearing had taken time, and neither of us mentioned this because it did not need to be mentioned. She was at the floor with her chalk before I had gotten my clipboard. I was in the maintenance corridor before she had finished the first annotation. The junction on sublevel 5, section 7C, had the spatial wrongness I had noted 17 months before and never fully documented. I crouched down beside the housing and put my hand flat against the wall and felt through the metal the faint vibration of something moving in the spaces beside the official routes, something following a path that was not a path in the conventional sense. That was not a path in any sense the official blueprints recognized, but that was nonetheless real, and that moved with the regularity of something that knew exactly where it was going even when no map said the route existed. I got out my clipboard. I started to write. The assessment ran to 7 pages. I documented the geometry precisely, the way you have to when the thing you are describing is technically impossible by the official model. Every measurement, every calculation, every comparison to the specifications in the original construction contract that the junction's actual behavior failed to match. At the end I noted, as I always did, that further review was indicated, and that the anomaly was consistent with theoretical predictions arising from the Velhari topological framework. Citation to Academic Registry, filing VTF 001. Then I took my orange chalk marker and made a mark on the wall beside junction 7C, not an X this time. Something Myra had taught me, the topological notation for stable or closed, or the configuration that holds. Not because anyone would see it who knew what it meant, because I had learned, in 4 years of working alongside a child who understood the geometry of things more precisely than anyone I had ever met, that marks matter. Small marks made in the right places in the junctions where the official map is wrong. They build up. They accumulate. They become, over time, a different map, not the one the powerful drew, but the one that records what is actually there. I went back to our quarters. Myra had finished her first tablet and started her second. She did not look up, but she made the small mark stable, closed. That meant she knew I was there, that the configuration held. I sat in my chair and began writing up the junction assessment. The record kept going. That was all. That was everything. Not the grand resolution, not the moment where the institution recognized its error and made it right, not the speech that ended with the crowd on its feet. Just the next form in the next corridor in the next session of work that nobody with authority ever watched, because the corridors where the real maintenance happened were not on the maps they kept. Just the two of us keeping the record. Just the record going on. There was a moment, 7 months in, that I have thought about many times since. I had come back from a 12-hour session in the sublevel 7 junction complex to find Myra sitting in the middle of our quarters with every chalk marker I owned arranged in a pattern on the floor around her. Not randomly. The pattern was precise, each marker placed at a specific angle and distance from the others, the whole thing forming a 3-dimensional notation I had learned enough by then to partially read. She was sitting at the center with her eyes closed and her hands in her lap and her lips moving through mathematics, and the expression on her face was one I had not seen before. Not the focused attention she brought to problem solving, not the careful watchfulness she brought to new situations, but something quieter than either of those things. Something that had no English word I could find for it, though the closest approximation I came to later was the word for the feeling of recognizing where you are when you have been lost. I stood in the doorway for a long time, not wanting to interrupt. Eventually she opened her eyes. She looked at the arrangement of chalk markers on the floor. She looked at me. "I found a station," she said. I did not understand immediately. I crouched down and looked at the arrangement, following the notation as best I could. The markers were representing positions, spatial positions, specific coordinates, and the relationships between them formed a path, not a straight path, a path that folded. "Where?" I said. "Sublevel 12, she said. "There is not a sublevel 12 on the official map." No, I agreed. But there is one, she said. I followed the junction geometry from sublevel 9. The system continues below the documented levels. There is a section that was built during the third expansion contract, the one in 2187 before the current transit authority took over. It is not sealed. It is just not mapped. She paused. There is a station. It has a name that is not on any map. The name is in Velhari notation. I looked at her. Someone put it there, she said. After the dissolution, someone came here to this hub and went down to a level that is not on any official document and wrote a name in the Velhari notation on the station wall, and then left. How long ago? The notation is fresh, she said, within the past year. I sat down on the floor across from her, among the chalk markers, and thought about this. Within the past year meant after the dissolution, after the administrative erasure. Someone, somewhere, was still using Velhari notation. Someone had come to this specific hub and marked a specific station in a sublevel that the official maps did not acknowledge. What does it say? I asked. The name. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said in the English translation, the place where the fold opens. We went down the next morning, before my shift. I had to lead the way for the first 4 levels because Myra knew the geometry of the system better than the physical corridors, and the physical corridors were not always where the geometry said they should be. But below sublevel 9, where the official mapping stopped, Myra led and I followed, through a series of passages that narrowed and expanded in a rhythm that felt, the further we went, less like architecture and more like something organic. The way a system grows when it is designed by someone who is thinking about the connections first and the walls second. The station was real. It was small, a single platform, a single track, the scale of something built for local use rather than network transit. The walls were old enough that whatever material they were made of had shifted color over the decades into something between gray and the color of water in low light. And on the back wall of the platform, in notation I could not yet read fluently but could recognize, was a name. And below the name, in smaller notation, what Myra translated for me slowly, as, for those who come after, the fold is still open. She stood looking at it for a long time. I stood beside her. Someone survived, she said finally. Or someone came back, I said. She thought about this. Either way, she said, we are not the only ones making marks. I documented the station. I documented it thoroughly, in the infrastructure assessment format, with measurements and coordinates and photographs and a complete record of the notation on the wall, because Myra was right about records, and I had learned that everything you do not document is a thing that can later be claimed not to have existed. The station went into the official record as a newly identified infrastructure component, unnamed corridor junction, sublevel 12, requiring further topological assessment. I also made a copy on paper for the other set of records. And I filed a query, very careful, very specific, routed through 3 different administrative offices to obscure the origin, asking whether any compact member kingdom had ever lodged an objection to the Velhari dissolution proceedings on the grounds that the unanimous consent requirement had not been met. The response, when it came 7 weeks later, said that no such objection was on file. It did not say that no such objection had ever been submitted. It said that no such objection was on file. I had been doing this long enough by then to know the difference. I filed a follow-up query asking for a complete record of all communications received by the Compact's central registry during the 30-day period following the Velhari dissolution vote, specifically any communications citing unanimous consent requirements under the Compact Formation Treaty. This query took 14 weeks to receive a response. The response said the records from that period were archived and not immediately accessible, and that retrieval would require a formal access request through the compact's historical documentation office. I filed the formal access request. While I waited, and waiting was most of what this kind of work consisted of, waiting and documenting and filing and then waiting again, I kept going to sub-level 12. Myra came with me sometimes. On the third visit, she brought her chalk and spent an hour adding a notation to the wall below the one that was already there. I did not ask her what it said. She would tell me if she wanted to. On the fifth visit, I noticed that the original notation, the one that had been there when we found the station, had an addition too, not from us, from someone else. Someone else was coming here. I did not see them. I looked carefully without making it obvious that I was looking, the same way I looked for anything in maintenance corridors, with peripheral attention, not head-on. I found traces, a notation here, a small chalk mark there, the kind of presence that knows it is working in spaces where being unnoticed matters. It reminded me more than anything else of Myra behind her decommissioned access panel, counting on her fingers, running calculations, waiting to see what I would do. I left a mark of my own on the sixth visit, not in Velhari notation. I did not have enough of the language yet to use it well, and imprecision felt wrong in a place like this. I left the mark Myra had taught me for stable, closed, the configuration that holds, the topological symbol that meant, I have been here and I have assessed the situation and it holds. On the seventh visit, someone had added a second mark beside it. The historical documentation access request came back 3 months later with a partial record. 9 communications, received in the 30 days following the Velhari dissolution vote, each one citing the unanimous consent requirement. Each one had been logged as received and then logged as unresolvable, which was an administrative category I had not encountered before, and which, when I traced its definition through 6 layers of procedural documentation, turned out to mean cannot be processed by current systems, referred to the administrative resolution queue. The administrative resolution queue. The phrase appeared in my records with a specific weight by then, because it was the same phrase the Velhari cultural liaison had used when I had first asked about Myra, the day I found her, before I understood what I was dealing with. I had learned by now that administrative resolution queue meant, in plain terms, we will hold this until we can make it disappear in an orderly fashion. The 9 communications had been sent by 9 different entities. 7 of them were listed as dissolved or unregistered, the compact's designation for things it had decided not to acknowledge. 2 of them were still active. One was a small academic institution in a non-signatory kingdom that I had not heard of before, but that, when I looked it up, appeared to have a mathematics faculty that had published, in the past 3 years, 4 papers in the field of topological physics, with footnotes citing a pre-dissolution Velhari framework. The other was a private individual, a citizen of one of the non-signatory kingdoms, registered in the compact's personnel database as a transit infrastructure consultant, currently unposted. I looked at that second listing for a long time. Then I filed a carefully worded message through the compact's official personnel contact system, addressed to the transit infrastructure consultant, noting that I was conducting a historical review of junction infrastructure in Compact Transit Hub Meridian 9, and would appreciate any information they might have regarding transit systems in use prior to the 3rd expansion contract of 2187. It was the kind of message that meant nothing if you did not know what it meant, and everything if you did. I received a response 11 days later. It contained 3 sentences about historical transit architecture and 1 sentence at the end that was not about transit architecture at all. But that was, in its precise and careful phrasing, the exact notation for, I know this station, I have been there, and I see your mark on the wall. I showed Myra, she read it 3 times, then she looked up and said, how many? At least 1 more, I said, probably more than 1. The academic institution cites the framework, which means someone there knows it well enough to use it. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "The tunnels remember." "Yes. But they also connect," she said. "That is the other thing, not just that the shape persists, that the fold opens in both directions. Whatever is on one end is reachable from the other end." She paused. "We have been filing records into the compact system, but records go in more than one direction." I understood what she was saying. I had been thinking of the record as a defensive measure, a way of making Myra harder to erase. Myra was suggesting it was also a signal that what I had been doing for months in the corridors of compact bureaucracy had been visible to people who knew how to look for it, and that they had been responding in kind, in their own corridors, in their own maintenance levels, with their own chalk marks, and their own notation on walls that the official maps did not acknowledge. I sent a second message to the transit infrastructure consultant, this one slightly less careful in its phrasing, slightly more direct in what it acknowledged. I sent a different kind of message to the mathematics faculty contact information listed for the academic institution, not through the compact's official system, but through a professional networking channel that transit auditors use to share documentation, and that is therefore, in the specific way that things are when they have never been important enough to surveil, not monitored. It took 2 months to establish that there were 7 of them, not a large number, but large enough to be a network, and a network means that no single point of failure can end it. Myra did not meet any of them. Not then, not yet. That was a conversation for later, when the formal recognition was in place, and the meeting could be documented in a way that made it structurally stable rather than vulnerable. But she knew about them. She added to the notation on the sub-level 12 station wall something that I asked her to translate for me, and that she rendered in English as, "The fold is open at both ends." I carried that into the next hearing. I did not say it aloud. It was not the language of administrative proceedings, but I carried it with me the way you carry a piece of correct mathematics, not as comfort exactly, but as orientation. Knowing the actual shape of the thing when other people are telling you the shape is different. The hearing, the final one, the one where Myra sat beside me and put her chalk away when they asked her to and did not change expression. I have described its outcome. What I have not described is the moment before the formal recognition was announced, when the representative from the Compact's Central Administrative Board, not the one from the Orith Conclave, not the Selenian or Meridian representative, but the one from the board itself, the closest thing the Compact had to a neutral party, looked at Myra directly and said, in the careful language of formal proceedings, that the board had reviewed the complete documentation associated with the current case, including the infrastructure assessments, the academic filings, the peer reviews, the historical access records, and the personal correspondence logs submitted as evidence, and had found the documentation to be, quote, exceptionally thorough. It was not an apology. It was not close to an apology. But in the language of institutions that do not apologize, it was the closest available formulation to, "We see you. We see the work you did. We see the shape of what you built in the corridors we were not watching, and we are acknowledging that it is real." Myra said, "Thank you," in the precise, unhurried way she said everything, and then she looked at the board representative and she said, "The documentation will continue." Not as a threat, as a statement of fact. The configuration holds. The fold is still open. I think about that moment sometimes, when I am in a maintenance corridor at 400 hub time with my clipboard and my chalk marker, and the junction that should not exist according to the official blueprints but does, and the faint vibration in the wall that says something is moving in the spaces the maps do not record. I think about the moment, and I think about the thing Myra showed me. The first day I crouched down in an unnamed corridor and held up one finger. The fold does not move you. It shows you that you were already there. I had been in those corridors for 16 years before I found her. I had been mapping the discrepancies between the official blueprints and the actual geometry of systems that had grown and changed and been expanded by people who did not always talk to each other. And I had thought of it as maintenance work, the unglamorous infrastructure of keeping transit systems functional. And it was that. It was exactly that. But it was also something else. All those years of following the power conduit instead of the map, of noting the junction that was 11 meters to the left and 1 level down, of making chalk marks so I could find my way back through passages that the official documentation pretended did not exist. All of it had been preparation for a specific kind of problem, which is the problem of a system that has been designed to root around something real and pretend it isn't there. The transit systems I had worked in for 16 years were full of those. Expansions contracted without consulting the original blueprints. Maintenance routes that had been demapped when the sections they served were decommissioned, but that the physical pipes and conduits still ran through. Junction chambers that had been sealed on the official record when the lines they served were rerouted, but that were still structurally part of the hub, still receiving power, still breathing the recycled air of the system they officially no longer belonged to. The compact was one of those systems. The Velhari had been demapped from it. The routes that ran through them had been officially rerouted, but the structure was still there. The connections were still there. The fold, as Myra had said, is not a shortcut. It is a description of what is already true. And what was already true, what had always been true, what the 7 kingdoms had spent their effort and their administrative violence trying to make untrue, was that the Velhari had existed and had understood something real about the shape of space, and had put that understanding into records that survived in the places the decommissioning process had not reached, and that those records connected to other records and other people, and other chalk marks on the walls of stations that were not on any map they were willing to show you. That was the topology of it. That was what I had spent 4 years, junction by junction, assessment by assessment, form by form, learning to map. Myra was not the end of the Velhari. She was the node I had found, the node that had found me. But the network was already there, had already been there, distributed and patient and placing its notation in the sublevels that no official process thought to purge, waiting for someone to follow the power conduit instead of the map, and find the junction that was 11 meters to the left and 1 level down. I was a transit infrastructure auditor. I had spent 16 years finding the junctions they got wrong. I had one more. I wrote it down.